The autumn of 1914 had transformed the rolling hills of northern France into a nightmare of mud, blood, and broken dreams. The grand illusions of a quick war, those promises of home before Christmas, had shattered like porcelain against the brutal reality of modern warfare. And nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the ancient cathedral city of Noyon, perched precariously on the western edge of what would become one of history's most infamous scars, the Western Front. Noyon was no ordinary prize. This was a city that had crowned Charlemagne emperor in 768 AD, where Gothic spires had watched over the Oise River Valley for centuries, where cobblestone streets remembered the footsteps of kings and pilgrims alike. But in September 1914, as the German Imperial Army swept through northern France in their audacious Schlieffen Plan, Noyon became something else entirely, a symbol, a strategic linchpin, and ultimately, a graveyard for thousands of young men who would never see their homes again. Captain Friedrich Weber stood in the bell tower of Noyon Cathedral, his field glasses trained on the western horizon. Below him, the city bustled with the organized chaos of occupation. German troops requisitioning supplies, engineers fortifying positions, and the sullen faces of French civilians watching their city transform into a military bastion. "Sir, the engineers report the eastern defenses are complete," reported Lieutenant Hans Miller, his boots echoing on the ancient stone steps. Weber lowered his glasses. At 32, he was already a veteran of the opening campaigns, having survived the brutal Battle of the Marne that had stopped the German advance just short of Paris. That September defeat had been Germany's first taste of disappointment in this war, and now in October the armies were racing northward, each trying to outflank the other in what military historians would later call the race to the sea. "And what of the French?" Weber asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Probing attacks, sir. Nothing serious yet, but our reconnaissance reports significant troop movements to the west. They're coming." Weber nodded slowly. He had studied the maps until his eyes burned. Noyon sat at the apex of a German salient, a dangerous bulge in the front lines that jutted westward into French-held territory. To hold Noyon was to threaten the Allied flank. To lose it would mean shortening the German lines, yes, but also admitting defeat, relinquishing valuable French territory, and the psychological advantage that came with it. "Tell the men to rest while they can," Weber ordered. "The French will not let us keep this city without a fight." He was right. Even as he spoke, 60 kilometers to the west, French commanders were finalizing plans for a counteroffensive. The city of Noyon had become a thorn in the side of the Allied line, and like any thorn, it would need to be removed. General Louis Monnery paced the floor of his command post, his riding boots leaving muddy tracks on the wooden planks. Outside, rain hammered against the canvas walls of the tent, a cold October rain that promised a miserable winter ahead. "The Germans are entrenching," said Colonel Pierre Duchamp, pointing to the map spread across the field table. "Every day we wait, they grow stronger. Noyon must be retaken before they can consolidate their position." Monnery studied the map. At 58, he was old enough to remember the humiliation of 1870, when Prussia had defeated France and taken Alsace-Lorraine. This war was about redemption, about proving that French courage and élan could overcome German discipline and firepower. But the last 2 months had taught him harsh lessons about the reality of modern warfare. "How many divisions can we commit?" he asked. 3, perhaps 4 if we strip other sectors. "But sir, the British are requesting we coordinate with their movements to the north." Monnery waved his hand dismissively. "The British can coordinate with us. Noyon is French soil, and we will liberate it with French blood if necessary." It was a sentiment born of pride, of wounded national honor, but it was also tactical reality. The German salient at Noyon created a dangerous angle in the Allied lines. Every supply column moving north had to detour around it. Every unit in the sector faced the possibility of envelopment from the east. The city had to be contested, if not immediately recaptured. "Very well," Monnery declared. "We attack in 3 days. Send word to the artillery commanders. I want every gun we can spare brought to bear on their positions. If we cannot drive them out with infantry alone, we will bury them under steel." The orders went out that evening, carried by dispatch riders who navigated muddy roads in gathering darkness. The French army, bloodied but unbroken from the Marne, was about to test its strength against the German defenses at Noyon. The bombardment began at dawn on October 12, 1914. Captain Weber was drinking ersatz coffee when the first French shells screamed overhead, exploding in the eastern districts of the city. Within minutes, the German positions erupted in coordinated response, and the duel of the guns began in earnest. Private Jean-Baptiste Moreau pressed himself into the muddy trench wall as shells burst overhead, showering his squad with dirt and debris. At 19, he had joined the army with dreams of glory, inspired by stories of Napoleon and the Grande Armée. The reality was far different, cold, wet, terrifying, and utterly without romance. "Fix bayonets," shouted Sergeant Levesque, his voice barely audible over the artillery barrage. "When the guns stop, we go forward." Moreau's hand shook as he attached the long blade to his level rifle. Around him, other young men performed the same ritual, their faces pale beneath layers of mud. They were the 45th Infantry Regiment, pulled from garrison duty in the south and thrown into the maelstrom of the Western Front with minimal preparation. The bombardment lifted suddenly, leaving a ringing silence that was almost more terrible than the noise. Then the whistles blew. "Pour la France. En avant." Moreau scrambled up the trench ladder with his comrades, emerging into a hellscape of smoke and churned earth. Ahead, perhaps 300 meters distant, he could see the German positions, sandbags, wire, and the dark mouths of machine gun emplacements. They had covered perhaps 50 meters when the German machine guns opened fire. The MG-08 Maxim was one of the most devastating weapons ever devised, capable of firing 500 rounds per minute with deadly accuracy. The French attack walked into a wall of lead. Men fell in rows, cut down like wheat before a scythe. Moreau threw himself into a shell crater, his ears ringing, his uniform splattered with blood that wasn't his own. "Back! Fall back!" Someone screamed, but the order was unnecessary. The survivors were already retreating, running, crawling back toward their own lines, leaving hundreds of their comrades dead or dying in the mud. Moreau made it back to the trench and collapsed, sobbing with relief and horror. His first attack had lasted less than 10 minutes. The 45th Regiment had lost a third of its strength without gaining a meter of ground. Captain Weber watched the French retreat through his field glasses, his expression grim. He felt no triumph, only the weight of command and the knowledge that this was merely the beginning. The French would come again. They had to. And each time, more young men would die for a city that neither side could afford to lose, but that might not matter at all in the grand scheme of the war. As October bled into November, the skirmishes around Noyon intensified. The French, frustrated by their inability to dislodge the Germans, brought up more artillery and fresh divisions. The Germans, determined to hold their salient, reinforced their positions and prepared for a long defense. Lieutenant Wilhelm Becker commanded a company of the 52nd Infantry Regiment, holding a section of trench 2 kilometers east of Noyon. A schoolteacher before the war, he had learned the craft of killing with the methodical precision he once applied to Latin grammar. "They're forming up again," observed Corporal Ernst Schmidt, peering through a periscope at the French lines. "Third time this week." Becker checked his watch. 3 in the afternoon. The French seemed to favor afternoon attacks, perhaps hoping the low sun would blind the German gunners. It rarely worked. "Pass the word to stand ready," Becker ordered, "and remind the men to aim low. Machine guns will handle the front ranks, but I want rifles on any officers or sergeants we can identify." The French attack came with artillery preparation this time, a rolling barrage that crept forward ahead of the infantry. It was meant to suppress the German defenses, to keep heads down and guns silent during the crucial moments when the infantry advanced. But the Germans had learned to adapt. They sheltered in deep dugouts during the bombardment, then rushed to their positions when the fire lifted. This time, the French made it to the German wire before the machine guns opened fire. Some brave souls even reached the German trenches, leaping into the positions with fixed bayonets, fighting hand-to-hand in the narrow confines. Becker found himself facing a French corporal, their rifles locked together, grunting and straining in a primordial struggle for survival. The German was younger and stronger. He twisted the Frenchman's rifle aside and drove his knee into the other man's stomach, then finished him with a brutal blow from his rifle butt. Around him, his men were doing the same. The French attack had penetrated the German lines but lacked the strength to exploit the breach. Within 20 minutes, the French were falling back again, leaving more bodies draped across the wire like macabre decorations. Becker slumped against the trench wall, his hands shaking, his uniform soaked with sweat and blood. They had held. But for how long? And at what cost? The November offensive around Noyon claimed thousands of casualties on both sides. The French launched attack after attack, each one carefully planned and bravely executed, each one smashed against the German defenses with horrific losses. The Germans held their ground but bled steadily from the constant attrition, their units growing smaller, their trenches filling with wounded men awaiting evacuation. December brought snow and ice to the Noyon salient, transforming the battlefield into a frozen wasteland. The trenches became rivers of freezing mud, and trench foot claimed as many casualties as German bullets. Both armies settled into a miserable routine of survival, punctuated by occasional raids and artillery exchanges. Moreau, now a veteran of 3 months fighting despite his youth, huddled in a dugout carved into the trench wall, trying to warm his hands over a small fire made from broken ammunition crates. The smoke made his eyes water, but it was better than freezing to death. "Letter from home," said his friend, Private Albert Rousseau, handing him a mud-stained envelope. Moreau opened it with numb fingers. His mother's handwriting brought tears to his eyes. News of his village, of harvests and marriages and births, of a world that seemed impossibly distant from this frozen hell. She wrote that his younger brother wanted to join the army when he turned 18 in the spring. "You have to write him," Moreau said aloud, to himself more than to Rousseau. "Tell him not to come. Tell him to run away to Spain or Switzerland. Anything but this." Rousseau said nothing. What was there to say? They both knew the letters they sent home were censored, stripped of any truth that might damage morale. They could not tell their families about the rats that fed on corpses in no man's land, about the screams of wounded men left to die in the wire, about the casual brutality that had become their daily existence. Across no man's land, the Germans faced the same miseries. Captain Weber's company was down to half strength, the remainder scattered among various field hospitals or buried in temporary graves behind the lines. Fresh replacements arrived weekly, younger and younger men with less and less training, thrust into positions of responsibility they were utterly unprepared for. On Christmas Eve, something unexpected happened. As darkness fell, German soldiers began singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The sound carried across the frozen wasteland, and gradually, hesitantly, French voices joined in with their own version. Tous nuit. Weber stood in his trench listening to the impromptu choir, feeling something break inside his chest. These were the same men who had been trying to kill each other hours before, would resume trying to kill each other tomorrow, and yet here they were, united in song across the divide of war. No formal truce developed around Noyon. The high commands on both sides had forbidden such fraternization after hearing reports from other sectors. But for one night the guns fell silent and men on both sides allowed themselves to remember they were human. January and February 1915 brought continued stalemate. Both sides launched limited attacks, more to maintain aggressive posture than with any realistic hope of breakthrough. The Noyon salient remained a constant irritant in the Allied line, but the strategic situation had stabilized. The Western Front had congealed into a continuous line of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the English Channel. In March, Lieutenant Becker was summoned to regimental headquarters. Major Steiner, his battalion commander, looked grave. "Wilhelm, we're being transferred north. Second Army needs reinforcements for the Ypres sector." Becker felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief at leaving this blood-soaked ground. Guilt at abandoning the comrades who would remain. "What about Noyon, sir?" Steiner shrugged. "Noyon will remain in our hands for now. But the war has moved on. The real battles are being fought elsewhere. Ypres, Champagne, Artois. We're being pulled out because we're experienced troops, and experience is the most precious resource we have." It was true. The eager volunteers and professional soldiers of 1914 were nearly all dead or wounded. The armies of 1915 would be composed largely of conscripts, citizen soldiers learning the trade of war in the worst possible classroom. Becker returned to his company to prepare for the transfer. As he packed his meager possessions, he looked out across no man's land one last time. How many men had died for these few kilometers of worthless ground? Hundreds? Thousands? And for what? On the French side, similar transfers were occurring. The 45th Regiment, reduced to a skeleton force, was pulled back for rest and refit. Moreau found himself on a train heading south, away from the front, staring out at the French countryside and marveling that such peaceful beauty could exist so close to such horror. "Do you think we'll go back?" Rousseau asked. Moreau didn't answer. He knew they would. The war had consumed them, had become the only reality they understood. The question wasn't whether they would return to the front, but whether they would survive it. In March 1915, General Joseph Joffre, Commander-in-Chief of French forces, met with his staff to review the strategic situation. The Noyon salient had become a topic of considerable debate. "We've suffered 20,000 casualties attempting to reduce this position," argued General Foch, "and the Germans have lost nearly as many defending it. What have either of us gained?" Joffre studied the map, his massive frame hunched over the table. He was known as Papa Joffre to the troops, a stolid, unflappable commander who had saved France at the Marne. But even his legendary composure was being tested by the realities of trench warfare. "The Germans cannot be allowed to hold a salient this deep into our lines," Joffre insisted. "It's a matter of principle as much as strategy." "Then we must commit to a major offensive," Foch countered. "No more of these piecemeal attacks. Either we take Noyon with overwhelming force, or we accept the status quo and redeploy our troops to more promising sectors." It was the central dilemma of World War I warfare, one that would be repeated countless times over the next 3 years. Every position, no matter how tactically insignificant, became invested with symbolic importance. To yield ground was to admit weakness. To attack was to sacrifice thousands of men for minimal gain. The only alternative was stalemate, but stalemate meant accepting the occupation of French soil by a foreign invader. In the end, Joffre made his decision. The Noyon sector would be maintained as an active front, with periodic attacks to keep German forces pinned in place. But there would be no major offensive. The primary French efforts would focus on the Champagne region and in Artois, where the terrain offered better prospects for breakthrough. On the German side, similar calculations were being made. General Erich von Falkenhayn, who had replaced the younger Moltke as chief of the general staff after the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, was equally pragmatic. "The Noyon salient is a defensive liability," argued his chief of operations. "We should withdraw to a shorter, more defensible line." Falkenhayn shook his head. "And hand the French a propaganda victory? Tell the German people that we're retreating? Unacceptable. We hold Noyon and force the French to bleed themselves white trying to take it." Thus, the strategic deadlock was formalized. Noyon would remain contested ground, not because either side could afford to win it, but because neither side could afford to lose it. By April 1915, the Noyon sector had settled into a routine of trench raids, artillery duels, and occasional small-scale attacks. The grand offensives had moved elsewhere, but men continued to die with grim regularity. Sergeant Levesque, now commanding what remained of his company after officers had been killed or wounded, led a night raid on German positions. 20 men crept across no man's land under cover of darkness, their faces blackened with mud, their rifles replaced with clubs, knives, and grenades, the weapons of close-quarters murder. They reached the German wire without being detected, cutting their way through with practiced efficiency. The raid was meant to capture prisoners for interrogation, to gather intelligence about German dispositions and morale. But it quickly devolved into a savage melee when a German sentry spotted them. Levesque killed 2 men with his knife before a grenade exploded beside him, shredding his left arm and side with shrapnel. He fell into the German trench semi-conscious, bleeding out onto the duckboards. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the terrified face of a German soldier, no older than 16, raising a rifle to finish him. But the shot never came. A German corporal pulled the boy's rifle down. "Enough, he's finished anyway. Get him to the aid station." Levesque woke hours later in a German field hospital, his arm amputated, his side bandaged. He was a prisoner now, but alive. The German corporal's moment of mercy had saved his life. Such moments of humanity were rare but not unknown. The men in the trenches, despite their national differences, often felt they had more in common with the enemy in the opposite trench than with the generals and politicians who directed their fates from comfortable headquarters far behind the lines. Moreau, back at the front after his rest period, wrote in his journal, "We are told the Germans are monsters, inhuman beasts who must be destroyed. But I have seen their dead and they look like us. They have photographs of wives and children. They write letters home. They sing sad songs. How can we hate men we do not know for reasons we do not understand? It was a dangerous thought, one that could lead to defeatism or mutiny if spoken aloud. But in the privacy of his journal, Moreau allowed himself to question the madness that had engulfed his generation. By September 1915, the war had been raging for over a year. The enthusiastic volunteers of 1914 were gone, replaced by conscripts and the walking wounded. The trenches had become elaborate fortifications, with multiple defensive lines, concrete bunkers, and increasingly sophisticated networks of wire and mines. The Noyon salient remained, a fixture on the maps of both high commands. And in the autumn of 1915, the French decided to make one more attempt to eliminate it. General Foch, now commanding the Northern Army Group, received orders to prepare an offensive in coordination with a larger British attack at Loos. The goal was to break through the German lines, encircle the Noyon salient, and restore mobility to the Western Front. "We'll have 2 days of artillery preparation," Foch told his subordinates. "Every gun we can muster. We'll pulverize their trenches, destroy their wire, bury their dugouts, and then we'll go over the top with 3 full divisions." The assembled officers nodded, their faces carefully neutral. They had heard such promises before. The reality was always different. Some Germans always survived the bombardment, some machine guns always continued firing, and men always died in heaps on the wire. But orders were orders. The offensive was scheduled for September 25, 1915, to coincide with the British attack at Loos. The bombardment began at dawn on September 23rd. For 48 hours, French artillery pounded the German positions around Noyon. Thousands of shells, high explosive, shrapnel gas, rained down on the trenches. The earth shook continuously. Men cowered in deep dugouts praying the timbers would hold, that a direct hit wouldn't bury them alive. On the morning of September 25th, the guns fell silent. In the French trenches, officers checked their watches, synchronized to the second. At precisely 6:30 a.m. the whistles blew. Moreau, now a corporal commanding a squad of replacements, climbed the trench ladder one more time. He was 20 years old and felt like an ancient veteran. Most of the men he'd trained with were dead. Most of his friends were dead. He expected to join them soon, but the attack for once went better than expected. The German defenses had been savaged by the bombardment. Entire sections of trench had been obliterated. The wire in many places had been blown to pieces. The French advance penetrated the first German line, then the second. For a few glorious hours it seemed the breakthrough had come. French troops occupied German positions, captured stunned prisoners, pushed forward into the enemy rear areas. Moreau found himself in a village 2 kilometers behind the original German front line, fighting house to house with his squad, clearing buildings one by one. But the German army had learned from a year of war. Reserves were positioned in depth, ready to counterattack any breakthrough. By afternoon, German reinforcements were streaming forward, and the French advance ground to a halt in the face of withering fire from positions they hadn't even known existed. The counterattack came at dusk. German troops, many of them fresh from the Eastern Front, fell on the exhausted French with savage determination. The battle raged through the night, a confused melee of small unit actions fought by the light of flares and burning buildings. When dawn broke on September 26th, the situation had stabilized. The French had gained ground perhaps 3 kilometers at the deepest point of penetration, but they had not broken through. The Noyon salient had been reduced but not eliminated, and the cost had been staggering. Moreau sat in a captured German trench surrounded by his surviving squad members, 3 men from the 12 he'd led over the top the previous morning. They were too exhausted to speak, too numb to feel relief at their survival. Around them, stretcher bearers worked continuously, evacuating thousands of wounded. The September offensive around Noyon officially ended on September 28th. The French claimed victory, citing the ground gained and the prisoners captured. The Germans also claimed victory, noting they had contained the breakthrough and maintained their essential positions. Both sides were right. Both sides were wrong. The war continued, indifferent to victory or defeat. Through the winter of 1915-1916, fighting around Noyon gradually diminished, Both sides were exhausted, their attention shifting to other sectors where new offensives were being planned. Verdun, the Somme, the Brusilov offensive in the east, the Noyon salient, that contested piece of ground that had claimed so many lives, faded from strategic importance. It remained in German hands until March 1917, when the Germans executed a strategic withdrawal to the newly constructed Hindenburg Line, abandoning Noyon voluntarily to shorten their front and free up reserves. When French troops finally entered the city without firing a shot, they found ruins. The cathedral's spires were collapsed, its walls pocked with shell holes. The streets were rubble. The civilian population, those who had survived occupation and bombardment, emerged from cellars looking like ghosts, pale and malnourished. Moreau was not there to see it. He had been killed on the Somme in July 1916, cut down by machine gun fire during an attack that gained nothing and cost everything. He was 21 years old. Lieutenant Becker survived the war. He returned to his teaching position in Bavaria in November 1918, but found he could no longer relate to his students' innocent questions. The war had changed him in ways he couldn't articulate. He died in 1944 during an Allied bombing raid on Munich, having survived one war only to be killed by another. Captain Weber rose to command a regiment and survived the war with numerous decorations. He never spoke of Noyon or any other battlefield experience. In his later years, he would sometimes wake at night, hearing the whistle of incoming shells, the screams of wounded men. The war had never really ended for him. The skirmish over Noyon, for it was officially classified as a series of skirmishes rather than a major battle, claimed approximately 40,000 casualties, split roughly evenly between French and German forces. It achieved nothing of lasting strategic importance. The ground contested in 1914-1915 was voluntarily abandoned in 1917 and changed hands several more times before the war's end. And yet it mattered. Every battle matters to the men who fight it, to the families who lose sons and fathers and brothers. Noyon mattered because young men died there, because courage was tested and found both sufficient and insufficient, because the grinding machinery of industrial warfare revealed itself there, as it did on countless other forgotten sectors of that terrible conflict. In Noyon today, there is a memorial to the soldiers who fought for the city. It lists names, French names, German names, names of men who became statistics, footnotes in history books, dust in the ground. Visitors come occasionally, mostly schoolchildren on educational tours, trying to comprehend a war that seems impossibly distant and yet whose consequences still shape our world. The great lesson of Noyon, if there is one, might be this: that strategic importance is often an illusion, that positions invested with tremendous significance at the time prove meaningless in hindsight, that men die not for ground but for ideas, of honor, duty, national pride, that may or may not be worth the cost. The skirmish over Noyon was not the largest battle of World War I, not the bloodiest, not the most tactically significant, but it was typical, a microcosm of the larger conflict, a study in futility and courage, in the grinding horror of trench warfare and the persistent hope that the next attack, the next offensive, the next sacrifice would somehow make a difference. It rarely did. But the men kept fighting, kept climbing out of the trenches into machine gun fire, kept believing in victory even as the evidence mounted that victory, in any meaningful sense, was impossible for either side. That is perhaps the most profound tragedy of all.